Hi everyone, Anchovies here, and in this video, we're going to be doing an in-depth Arlecchino guide. So first to start out, Arlecchino is the fourth of the Fatui Harbingers, and she runs the House of the Hearth under the name of Father. Her role in the game is to be an on-field power DPS, primarily dealing damage through her normal attacks. So starting with her normal attacks are a 6-hit combo string, and she can enter the Mask of the Red Death state. Now this state activates when she has a Bond of Life worth 30% or more of her max HP. When the state is active, she'll get infused power attacks that are not overridable. When active, they'll deal extra damage based on her current attack, Bond of Life percentage, and Mask of the Red Death ratio. This is considered an additive damage bonus, similar to things like Zhenyun's second passive and Shenhe's Icy Quills. And what this means is that basically it'll take the base damage that you're dealing and then add that onto it. And this additive damage bonus scales based on her attack, times her Bond of Life, and her Mask of the Red Death ratio. Each normal attack on hit will consume a portion of her current Bond of Life and reduces her elemental skills cooldown. If you hold her charge attack for a long period, it will cause her to enter a high speed state where she can travel across very fast. At most, she can do this for up to 5 seconds, or basically when your stamina bar runs out. Casting her elemental skill summons initial spikes to nearby enemies, then cleaves the closest enemy to deal AoE pyro damage. Enemies that are hit are marked with Blood Debt directives. Blood Debt directives last 30 seconds, and will deal power damage once every 5 seconds for a maximum of 2 damage instances. This is similar to something like Hu Tao's Blood Blossoms, and with these, they do not apply pyro when they deal damage itself, meaning that if you're worried about ruining something like some setups like VV Vape for example, this will not affect the application onto the enemy. Arlecchino can then consume these marks after she uses a charge attack. Each mark that she absorbs grants 65% Bond of Life, and she can get a maximum of 145% Bond of Life per elemental skill consumption. Now each consumption is independent per skill use, meaning that for example, let's say I use a skill, absorb the Bond of Life and then do some of her combos, then I use her skill again and then absorb the Bond of Life again, it'll take the leftover Bond of Life from the previous rotation and add on to the now new absorbed Bond of Life, which makes it really nice for following rotations where Arlecchino can continuously start with more and more Bond of Life at the start of these rotations. Her elemental skill does have a 30-second cooldown, which is why her normal attacks decrease her elemental skill's cooldown on hit, and she does get additional characteristics from her first passive. So from her first passive, she'll get 130% Bond of Life if a enemy that was marked dies before she absorbs it. So this is nice for things like multi-wave content where enemies typically die before you can probably even do like a full-blown rotation sometimes. And after 5 seconds, the mark will then transform into a Blood Debt Dew, and this will grant her 130% Bond of Life per mark instead. And you can tell that this transforms into a Blood Debt Dew based on the visual cue of the mark. So it'll go from a dark red and a smaller X to a bright and a larger X. Her elemental burst has a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost. It will absorb nearby Blood Debt directive marks and will clear them, dealing AoE power damage, resetting her elemental skills cooldown, and healing her based on her current Bond of Life and attack. Now this is her primary method of self-sustain, and you'll understand why when we get into her unique passive in just a second. For Arlecchino's second passive, she'll gain 1% elemental and physical resistance for every 100 attack that is above 1000. So this means at most she can get 20% resistance, or this means that it caps at 3000 attack. Now this typically only translates to taking approximately X% less damage, and while this does provide some minor tankiness for Arlecchino, this is not going to be her main method of self-sustain. Because say for example, you're taking an attack that deals like 8000 damage, with this resistance increase, say you have like maybe 2k attack, you're looking at what, about like 10% resistance, then you're taking approximately like 10% less damage, which means instead of 8000 you're taking about like 6.5, maybe even like 7000 damage instead, which is like a 1000 damage reduction, which is nice, but in cases where you're against bosses like Capilia that do a lot of damage instances in quick succession, you can still get one shot very easily without defensive utility and if you're not careful. Now for her unique passive, when Arlecchino is in combat, she will gain a 40% power damage bonus, but can only be healed through her elemental burst. Now what this means is that she basically can't get healed from any external sources while she's in combat. However, this only applies in combat, meaning that outside of combat, in cases like exploration and other scenarios, she can still get healed from other sources, which makes things like exploration not completely dreadful to do with Arlecchino. Transitioning over to her constellations, let's begin with her constellation 1. So her C1 directly increases the Mask of the Red Death ratio by 100%. Additionally, it will increase her interruption resistance when she's doing normal or charge attacks while she's in the Mask of the Red Death state. So this interruption resistance is akin to something like Zincho's Rainsword interruption resistance, which does make things like shielderless gameplay a little bit more comfortable to play. And this translates to about a 30% DPS increase in most cases. For her C2, Blood Debt directives will immediately become Blood Debt due when they are first applied, which is nice for things like shorter rotation patterns or if you're doing something like solo or duo speedrun content. Then after she consumes Blood Debt directives, she will unleash an AoE power explosion that deals 900% of her attack. And this has no ICD, meaning that in things like vape teams, this will basically always vape. This also increases her elemental and physical resistance by 20% for 15 seconds, which actually notably improves her self-sustain and makes this resistance increase actually pretty nice on top of her second passive's resistance increase. This can be triggered once every 10 seconds. And overall, this will translate to around a 13% DPS increase. Her Constellation 3 increases her normal attack level by 3, which is nice since most of her damage does come from her normal attacks. And this overall gives about a 13 to 15% damage increase. For her C4, after she absorbs Blood Debt directives, her Elemental Burst cooldown will decrease by 2 seconds and give her back 15 energy. And this has a 10-second cooldown. Now this effectively does nothing, unfortunately, since Arlecchino does not need to use her burst in every single rotation, and this is especially the case in content where you're using her with a shielder. So this is more like an on-the-way constellation for C6, and the same can be said about her C5, because her C5 increases her Elemental Burst level by 3. And for her Elemental Burst, not only are you not using it every rotation, but even when you're using it, it by itself does not really contribute to a lot of her damage output. So again, this is just also another on the way to C6 constellation for Arlecchino. Now for her C6, her Elemental Burst now becomes a bit more relevant because now her burst damage is increased by 700% of her attack times the current Bond of Life percentage that she has at the time that she casts it, which does make using her burst in basically every rotation more priority. And after she uses her elemental skill, her normal and burst crit rate and crit damage are increased by 10% and 70% respectively. This effect does have a 15-second cooldown, and this translates to about a 30% or even upwards DPS increase. Now for a constellation priority, of course, there's C6, then after C6, you have the choice of either getting C1 or getting her R1. Now which to choose is very context dependent. For the case of both of them, they both provide similar DPS increases for the average player, and typically this will often boil down to things like your current accessibility in terms of the weapon department, as well as your preferences just as a player. I would say get C1 if you have one of her 5-star crit or attack weapons already, or you have or plan to get something like a highly refined deathmatch for her. Another case could be if you just simply want to play offensive setups more comfortably, thanks to the interruption resistance and also the enhancement on her normal attacks. Cases where you would get her weapon instead typically mainly stem from the case of if you just don't have that many weapon options and you're either more on the free-to-play side, or let's say you do have deathmatch but you only have a like R1, and you're kind of just rocking an R1 deathmatch or like Ballad of the Fjords or maybe even like Blackcliff Pole. And just in the case where you do not have that many options really to choose from, or the weapons options that you do have aren't that powerful, then that's a case where I could say R1 would then be the better choice to go for. On top of the fact that, well, her weapon just looks really sick. It looks really cool on her. It's amazing, it's beautiful, and it fits her perfectly from an aesthetics point of view. So of course you could just go for it purely for the drip. Now for rotations and combos, typically you almost always want to start with her elemental skill. This is so you can swap to your supports to let the Blood Debt directive transform into a Blood Debt due for more Bond of Life on consumption, and this is especially the case in single target scenarios. However, in AoE it is fine to absorb the Blood Debt due marks early, or sorry, the Blood Debt directive marks, because you'll get more of them and you'll typically max out if there's like 2 or more enemies for the most part. And typically how most rotations go is you start with her elemental skill, then swap to your supports, which takes about 5 seconds or even more, then you swap to Arlecchino to use a charge attack to absorb nearby marks, and then you just do whatever combo that you feel like doing. Arlecchino, in terms of her combo string, doesn't really have a super strict combo pattern. The one that I find myself doing at least the most is typically doing 5 normal attacks and then dashing, and I typically do this about 3 times and then end it with maybe a couple more normal attacks before repeating the combo. You can of course do something like a full N6 combo a couple times, followed by the last couple normal attacks before swapping out. You can also do something like 3 normal attacks and then dashing, which is especially decent for things like either vape or like melt setups where you want to melt specific hits. Something that I will note about if you're doing a full N6 combo is that her last normal attack sometimes won't hit if you do decide to dash, because sometimes you can actually dash too early even though the animation looks like it's finished. The animation time actually takes quite a bit, so if you are using her last normal attack, make sure that you fully wait for it to finish before you do any other animation. So now let's get into some pros and cons for Arlecchino. So let's start with the pros. The first pro is that she's very flexible in terms of her rotation patterns. You can start with her skill, you can absorb marks early in AoE situations, or you can let them cook basically in single target scenarios. There's cases where maybe you swap to her early, swap to her later. She has a little bit more freedom in terms of when she goes in and out of the field, sometimes depending on the team composition. And she's a character that actually benefits from fights that take multiple rotations, because while she does do a lot of damage even in the first rotation, she gets leftover bond of life in following rotations, which allow her to start with more bond of life, which then indirectly increases the damage that she does at the start of rotations for her normal attacks. She's also pretty mechanically easy to play. There's nothing really difficult to understand about Arlecchino. You press her skill, absorb marks, and then just go ham. She does not require any combo setups or anything that make her difficult to pilot, like say Hu Tao, for example, who requires knowing how to do like N1C, or at certain constellation periods like C1, doing like 2 normal attacks and dashing or something like that. She's very mechanically easy. Her attacks also have a relatively wide and large AoE, so like in something like 2 or 3 enemy scenarios, oftentimes you will actually be able to hit all of them if they're within a certain range, because her attacks actually cover a decent wide area. She also has a decent amount of team and teammate variety. She can be played in like Vape or like Overload. She can also be played in like mono teams like Mono Power or like Double Geo. And within those team archetypes, she has a lot of units that she can pick and choose from, whether they're Geo units, Animo units, Electro, Pyro, etc. She has a lot of variety in who she can pick and choose to be played with these teams. She has a very strong vertical investment. If you get her C1, C2, or like her weapon or something like that, or even all of the above, she becomes a really powerful unit to use. And she can be played in various scenarios. You can play her in single target by waiting for her blood debt due before you absorb the mark. You can play her in minimal AoE situations against like 2 or 3 enemies. You can even play her against large AoE content with multiple enemies with a crowd controller. She just has a lot of flexibility in terms of the situations that she can be played with, the teammates that she can be played with, as well as when she goes in and out of the field. Now onto her cons. Her main cons is that there are situations where she can feel quite squishy if she doesn't have defensive utility, especially when she's at C0, and just not having defensive utility or that C1 or C2 for that extra resistance and interruption resistance can feel quite painful sometimes. The next point is that of course Bennett sneaks himself in to buff yet another attack scaling unit, although he's not as necessary in certain teams like say Vape or Chevreuse Overload, because you can do something like Triple Pyro just with Chevreuse as your main buffer, or in Vape you can do something like Double Hydro Vape without Bennett. Bennett still buffs Arlecchino really well. She still gets a lot of benefit from his flat attack buff, and while she doesn't get benefit from his healing, the flat attack buff is just more than enough to justify using them in a decent amount of her team archetypes. And the last point is that at low investment, her performance, I would say, can feel lackluster to some people, especially if you're typically using her more free-to-play friendly weapons or even team compositions. Just in general, not really having her weapon or like her next best options can kind of feel bad sometimes. Now onto her builds, starting with her artifacts. Talking about artifact sets, typically you want to go for 4-piece Harmonic Whimsy. 2-piece provides 18% attack, 4-piece provides a dynamic damage bonus increase when her bond of life increases or decreases. This fits perfectly with Arlecchino's gameplay because she gets bond of life through absorbing the blood debt directives and then consumes bond of life over time, which means that she can basically get max stats almost instantly for the majority of her rotations and combos, so this is a perfect set for her. Next in line are sets like 4-piece Gladiators Finale and 4-piece Echoes. 4-piece Gladiators and Echoes both provide an attack increase in their 2-piece as well. For Gladiators, it provides a 35% normal and charge attack damage bonus for Arlecchino, which is really nice for her. It makes it her general second best option. Echoes follows right behind, especially if you have lower ping. She'll get an occasional normal attack damage increase, but of course this passive effect is RNG based. On average, you'll probably get like 7 to like maybe even like 9 procs depending on your ping and just your luck. It's a very luck-based artifact set, but in general, it will perform well enough to where if you have a good set and you have good ping, then it will perform really good. Next up is 4-piece Gilded Dreams. This is mainly just for Vape teams, realistically, because it provides 80 EM in the 2-piece, and in the 4-piece, it gives her some attack and elemental mastery based on the party composition that she has, which typically she'll be in a double pyro with 2 different elements. She'll gain the attack increase for 1 stack, and get 2 stacks of the elemental mastery increase of the passive. Now, a very niche set that she can use that actually performs decent is 4-piece Desert Pavilion Chronicle. Obviously, again, this is niche and I wouldn't really recommend just slotting this on her, but this is just one of those things where it just oddly works because of the way that the 4-piece works, in the fact that it increases her normal attack speed by 10%, but also giving her a normal and charge attack damage increase by 40%. And then lastly, there's 2-piece variations. Typically, you want the first set to be power damage, and then the last 2-piece either being attack percent or something like Marchesi Hunter to increase her normal and charge attack damage. For main stats, in the Sands department, most cases you typically want to run an attack percent Sands. It is somewhat justifiable to run an Elemental Mastery Sands if it has really good stats, but this is only really in the case of something like Vape teams. For her goblet, you can either run a power damage goblet or an attack goblet. This generally comes down to a substat difference in a lot of cases, but the general consensus is if you get a lot more damage percent external buffs, then go for an attack goblet, especially if it has better stats. And the vice versa is true for power damage goblet if you are getting more attack percent or flat attack buffs from things like, say, Bennett, power resonance, or like noblesse or something. Then that's where power damage goblet will then just straight up pull ahead. And then for circlet, you can just opt for a crit rate or a crit damage circlet, depending on your stat needs. For substats and goal priority, typically you want around 2000 to 2200 attack at base. She does not need energy recharge, especially if she is bursting every other rotation, but in cases where you do decide to burst every rotation if you want to, she'll typically need anywhere from 120 to 150 energy recharge depending on if she is the only power unit, or if she is running one other power unit, or is in a triple pyro team. In terms of priority, first meet her energy needs if you are bursting every rotation, then opt for crit stats, then attack percent or flat attack, and if you're running her in a vape team, then it can be nice to get some elemental mastery in there as well. Next, let's move on to weapons, starting with her 5-star weapons. Her best weapon is of course her signature, which is Crimson Moon Semblance. It's 15% better than her next best 5-star option, and 20% or more better than her next best 4-star option. It gives her extra bond of life and damage bonus based on her bond of life, and for other units, it's sort of a mid stat stick. Her next best options are Staff of Scarlet Sands and Jade Wing Spear. Scarlet will marginally outperform Jade Wing Spear in vape, but in the majority of scenarios, Jade Wing Spear will typically slightly pull ahead. Oftentimes, it just depends on either if you have one or the other, or if you have both, and maybe you have a case where maybe you have units that would rather use Scarlet, then you would give Arlecchino Jade Wing Spear instead. Next in line is non-crit rate stat weapons, so things like Staff of Homa, Calamity Queller, or Vortex Vanquisher. These are decent stat sticks for Arlecchino, but they're not as beneficial since Arlecchino is a character that ascends with crit damage rather than crit rate. And in the case of Homa specifically, she gets little to no uptime on the second part of the passive because in a lot of cases you don't want her to be reaching below 40% max HP, or sorry, 50% max HP. And for Vortex Vanquisher, this typically assumes that you are using a shielder or you're getting stuff like crystallized shields or something. But in cases where you're running her in shielderless teams, then the effect of the passive may be a little bit less significant. In the 4-star department, the best one is of course Deathmatch, and this can especially compete with her better 5-star options that are not crit rate stats at higher refinements. Ballad of the Fjords is next in line. Can't compete with R1 Deathmatch at R5, but that doesn't mean it's good. Its power is somewhat limited to vape teams because all it really offers is the passive effect for an increased elemental mastery. So outside of vape teams, not necessarily too powerful, which makes it overall kind of a mid weapon to get from the battle pass. Now, if you are someone who owns a highly refined lithic spear, and say you play her in teams where she can actually get 2 or even like 3 stacks in something like double hydro with Zhongli, then it can be somewhat competitive with a highly refined deathmatch sometimes. But like, I don't know any of y'all who own this weapon and actually use it, but if you do, you can. There is of course Dragon's Bane, but this is sort of like an absolute last option. And even some of the free-to-play options perform better than this weapon, even in things like vape teams, which is unfortunate. And this mainly stems from the fact that not only does it offer a low base attack stat, but it's a really high elemental mastery stat that isn't as beneficial compared to something like attack or crit for Arlecchino. Arlecchino is a character that while she can vape, because she's normal attack base, she does not vape that many of her hits compared to something like Hu Tao, who vapes pretty much like almost all of her damage, which makes Dragonbane a little bit more valuable in vape teams. And in the free-to-play department, we of course have weapons like Missive Wind Spear, White Tassel, or if you have extra star glitter that you can use, then Blackcliff Pole. Missive Wind Spear is of course unfortunately event limited, so if you don't have it, then womp womp. White Tassel is of course free that you can get from like chess or gacha or whatever. You gotta work with what you got if it's all you got, you know what I'm saying? And then Blackcliff Pole, of course, again, cost star glitter, eel, yucky, and it's a crit damage stat, which isn't as good because Arlecchino also ascends with crit damage, but if you have nothing better, then it's completely fine. But it doesn't help that the passive is also conditional based on enemies that you defeat, meaning that in cases like single target or minimal AoE situations against 2 or 3 enemies, which is typically the situations that Arlecchino tends to play in, it will not be as great. Now, as for team compositions, typically these teams will include Bennett, although in some cases like Chivalrous Overload or like vape teams, he is not as necessary, but he'll still benefit them in a really good way nonetheless if you do decide to slot him in there. Starting with vape teams, you can do something like solo hydro with either Zincho or Yelan. The case with Zincho and Yelan is the fact that Zincho sacrifices some personal damage for some more defensive utility, while Yelan of course sacrifices defensive utility for more damage as well as a team-wide damage percent increase. And if you have Zincho at higher constellations, especially like C2 or C6, then he can be a little bit more competitive on top of the fact that he also applies more application than her. Now, of course, if you don't feel like running solo hydro, it's perfectly fine to do something like double hydro with both Zincho and Yelan together, still makes a powerful duo core. And then for the flex slot, you have options between using an animal flex, so characters like Kazuha, Sucrose, Venti, or just other animal units that can hold Viridis and Venera. You also have choices of geoflex units, so either a shielder like Zhongli, or if you want more of the damage side, you do have the option of doing something like Albedo or Chiori. Or if you're using Nahida for something like this current Abyss where there is the Baptist and you need to just break elemental shields quickly, then Nahida can also be a nice Dendro flex for this composition. The next archetype is Monopyro. Monopyro, of course, typically has to consist of her and Bennett for pretty much all of these teams. And in the last two slots, you have the choice of either doing an Animo or a Geo duo. You can do a double Geo duo with like Albedo Chiori together, or just one or the other with Zhongli. Or you can do a triple Pyro setup with Xiangling, and then the last slot being like an Animo unit, or Zhongli if you think that you need the defensive utility more. The next archetype is Chevreuse Overload. You can either do triple Pyro with Chevreuse and a last Pyro slot, with the last slot being a solo Electro unit, something like Fischl or Yamiko, or even like Beidou if you really wanted to, although with Beidou, not as realistic because then her energy needs are going to be really high in those cases. So if you do want to use Beidou, then I would rather you do that in the cases of the next part, which is doing double Pyro and double Electro, which is a more realistic scenario where you can use Beidou because then she could do like Beidou and Fischl, or Beidou and Yai, so that way she at least gets some extra particle generation from another Electro unit. And in double Pyro, it's mainly just going to be Arlecchino and Chevreuse because you kind of have to do it like that. And you have the option of building Chevreuse either more offensive oriented, which is especially nice if you have her at higher constellations like C1+ or even like C6. Or you can build her more supportive oriented, which is typically the case if you don't have her at that many constellations. That doesn't really benefit from building her more damage like. And then the last archetype that I'll mention here is Melt. Now, I've tested various Melt teams, and the best ones that I've personally worked with has been like double Cryo with something like Layla and Kaya or Rosario together. Most of the time, I prefer Kaya, but if Rosario is all you got, then you can use Rosario. You can also swap Layla for something like Diona in that slot if you really wanted to. I just find Layla a little bit more reliable, especially if you have her at higher constellations, because of her off-field application through her elemental bursts and also her star shots, as well as the fact that she can hold something like 4-piece tenacity to give some extra attack percent for Arlecchino. You can also do something like a Cryo unit like Kaya or Rosario with an Animo unit like Kazuha, Sucrose, Venti, etc. Kazuha especially because he can infuse his elemental burst with Cryo to at least let Arlecchino melt some of her attacks through that method. And yeah, that's going to do it for this Arlecchino guide video. If you guys did enjoy, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more content from me. And until the next video, bye-bye.